Francisco Ferreira studies poverty at the World Bank. He says one region in particular is leading the way.
There has been dramatic change over the last, not only over the last few years, but over the last decade and a half in Asia, with the fabulous growth of places like China, India, and a number of other countries. There's been massive declines in poverty there, from over half their population in 1990 being under the equivalent of $1.90 today before, to about maybe 7% now. So much, a huge story, probably the biggest development story this last half century has been the rise of Asia out of poverty. In Africa, we've also seen progress, but at a much slower pace, in part because even though there's been less growth there, but also that growth has been less pro-poor, less inclusive, even for the growth that there was. Not everywhere, but on the whole in Africa.
You brought up Asia, of course. China, just an unbelievable story to see how many people have been lifted to the middle class out of poverty. Are there models that you see in perhaps China or India that can be duplicated, replicated elsewhere, or is it just case by case?
Well, it's a mix of the two. It's always hard to say replicate a full model somewhere else because no place is exactly like China, just like no industrial revolution was exactly like Britain's. Each historical case is, in some sense, its own historical case. But there are some broad principles. I mean, one of the things that China did extremely well was to combine both really widespread public education and availability of public health, even before the 1980s, with then an openness to markets and international trade beginning in the 1980s. So I like to think of the China story as a story of widespread opportunity by giving people, even in rural areas, even when they were still poor, they had access to health, they had access to education, they had rural roads. And then suddenly when you expose them to markets and the incentives that markets give, a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of economic activity coming out of that. At that level of general principles of both providing people with the opportunities, but also the market access that they need, yes, there are examples that can be taken elsewhere, and indeed are being applied across a number of countries in Africa, for example.
I was looking at this during the global economic meltdown. We saw progress slow just about everywhere on the planet. I was looking at this child poverty rates came up. In places even like Iceland, child poverty rate spiked to 20%. And those are figures, but there are faces behind the figures. There's real people there. Who is affected most by poverty, would you say? Is it children? I mean, describe for us who's suffering out there.
You know, one interesting thing about your question, mentioning Iceland, for example, is just the differences in the kinds of poverty. There's poverty in Iceland, there's poverty in the United States, there's poverty in every country, really, including the rich countries. The kind of poverty that the numbers we've been talking about refer to, the kind of poverty that we at the World Bank focus on, is actually even worse than that in some sense. It's people living under the equivalent of what $1.90 would buy you every day. But that kind of poverty is very rare. We're talking about people not having enough to eat, living in mud huts with no electricity, and having, in Niger, the average number of children a woman will have, the average number is 7. And many of them will be living in mud huts without electricity. That kind of lack of opportunity is just staggering. We're talking about schools with no teachers. We're talking about no electricity. We're talking about no clean water, the basics that we take for granted. And that is what, we're still seeing. According to our projections for 2015, 700 million people in those situations. It's about lifting these people up that we're really trying to do.